Houston, be advised the visual is go today. This is Houston, roger out. Let me know when it converts. Yeah, they're finally getting your window like that. That's good, blank bird. Steering bird, yep. 11 Houston, your guidance is...
Welcome to the Cosmosphere Podcast, Episode 13, Earthrising Part 2.
Bill Windler, you had experience during Apollo 13 of the critical role the lunar module could play in serving as a backup engine. Apollo 8, however, is going without the lunar module. Were you concerned that there would be no redundancy for the single SPS engine that Apollo 8 would need to rely on to enter and exit lunar orbit?
Well, you want to remember that I was a brand new flight director at this time. This was my very first mission. And then people like Bosick and Frank here and these other folks said that everything was going to work. I was willing to accept that. Cliff Charlesworth and Money and people like that had flown a whole bunch of missions. And if Charlesworth was willing to do it, I was sure willing to go. I'm kind of like Jim Lovell over here. I was delighted to be assigned to the mission, and I can't really say that I had a tremendously large part in it because, like I say, I was just a young flight director, and so I was willing to accept all that. And if the guys in the flight control said they could do it, I believed them.
Jim Lovell, I love the story you told me about riding to the top of the launch tower on launch morning. When we were going to load in and seeing the lights of the approaching meteor. Could you describe what it was like going to the top there and getting ready to enter the spacecraft?
Well, of course, we only had 4 months to really train, and we did a lot of stuff. I was the navigator, and I had to do a lot of training to navigation, and I was going from the launch control tower on that bridge over to the spacecraft itself, and I was some 360 feet high, and suddenly I saw the lights of the press corps coming to the press site. And suddenly it dawned on me, we're really going to the moon. I guess all that navigation training was for real. And that's how it began.
Also, Jim, can you describe a little bit about the first moments of launch on the Saturn V? Bill Anders said that nothing that you had simulated or trained yourselves for could have prepared you for the actual experience of the Saturn V. Did you find that to be true as well? Yes.
I'm sorry.
About your experience on the Saturn V, was it, as Bill Anders told me, so violent that nothing in training or simulation could have prepared you for that experience, or was it something you were expecting?
Well, the Apollo Flight 8 was entirely different from anything I had known. I had made 2 Gemini flights, but this was entirely different, and so it was a new experience for me, but it was one that gave me self-satisfaction because the equipment that we had developed, the systems that we were using, all worked on Apollo 8 as they should have, and that was very satisfying to me.
Jerry Bostic, let's get to the part of the mission when Apollo 8 is closing in on the moon. The goal is to orbit just 69 miles over the lunar surface. The spacecraft is moving at about 5,000 miles an hour. The moon itself is moving at more than 2,000 miles an hour. At this time, Bob Gilruth, George Lowe, and other top NASA managers in mission control were asking engineers, only half-jokingly, how sure are you that we're not going to crash into the moon? So, Jerry, my question to you is, how sure were you that Apollo 8 was not going to crash into the moon?
Well, at that time, I was very confident. We had trapped it all the way during the translunar phase, and everything was going smoothly. We were shooting for 60 miles in front of the moon. And when you shoot through the moon, it's like duck hunting. You don't shoot at the duck, you shoot out front and let the duck fly in. We were feeding for 60 miles out there and the moon was going to fly. And I figured that we need enough to put the spacecraft there, and God need enough to get the moon.
And then when the spacecraft passes behind the moon and communication goes dark with mission control, Glenn Lundy suggests that everybody take a break. And what was your reaction to that suggestion that you take a break at this point?
Initially, I thought, Glenn, you lost your mind. Here we've got two Americans behind them, and you're saying take a break, you know? But then I thought, that's typical of Glenn. That's one of the smartest things I've ever heard. Not a damn thing we can do about it. So, you know, we've got about 20, 25 minutes here. So it is a good time to take a break.
Jim Lovell, can you tell us about Earthrise? Did you expect to see it? What was it like to see it? And did you realize that something profound was happening as you saw it?
Well, as we orbited the moon, and first of all, when we got around the moon, it was completely dark, so we knew the moon was somewhere very close. And finally, as we kept orbiting towards the other side, the sunlight suddenly came up, and we saw the ancient old craters on the far side. And that was really something that really amazed all three of us. We just stared at those ancient craters just 60 miles below, and then suddenly I looked up. And I saw the Earth come up, and I realized that what I was looking at was something that was 240,000 miles away. And it brought my mind the fact, and I've said this story many, many times, that when I first saw the moon at that time, I put my thumb up to the window, and I could hide the Earth behind my thumb, which meant that over 5 billion people, and everything I ever knew was behind my thumb. And it sort of gave me a different feeling of where we are, how we existed. I looked down at the Earth, and it was only one of 9 planets in the solar system. It was a mere speck in our galaxy, and of course it was lost to oblivion in the universe. So it got you to start thinking.
This question is to all the panelists, except you, Jim. What do you all remember about the Christmas Eve broadcast and the reading of Genesis? Did any of you expect it, and what was your reaction to it?
I can tell you that I didn't expect it, and my reaction was awe, I guess. It was incredible.
I actually had goosebumps. I really did. I just actually heard that and couldn't believe it. And I thought, how appropriate, really.
I certainly didn't expect it, but I thought, like I think everyone else was how perfect we got Americans circling the moon on Christmas Eve, and you're reading from Genesis. It just brought tears to my eyes.
I'm sure there's some people out there that had a birthday on Christmas Eve or Christmas. And most of them that I had Christmas Eve, I didn't remember because it was Christmas Eve and Christmas Day was coming up. And I remember celebrating my birthday on Christmas Eve with the family and getting up, I think it's the second piece of cake, and walking into the living room and watch all the way on the TV. And it wasn't long after that the crew read the book of Genesis. And I thought, my 31st birthday, I'll never forget it.
Very neat, but I was also very busy computing DEI and didn't bring them home. Jim, when you finally left lunar orbit and reconnected with home, you broadcast, "Be advised, there is a Santa Claus." Where did those words come from, and how did they come to you? Did you plan to say that, or where did it come from?
No, that idea that please be advised there is a Santa Claus is from a newspaper correspondent many years ago. A young lady wrote to him saying, "I've heard from other people that there isn't a Santa Claus." And then the newspaper correspondent sent down a very nice letter telling this young lady why, of all the things that could happen, that there really is a Santa Claus to her. And so I thought it was very appropriate when that engine lit and it fired for the amount of time to give us the increased velocity to escape from the moon's gravity and head us back towards the Earth, that it was only appropriate to say that please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
And this is for any of the panelists. As we noted, Apollo 8 occurred at the very end of 1968, one of the most terrible and divisive years in our country's history. Do you remember being aware of the tumult in the country at the time, and also starting to understand what the flight of Apollo 8 might mean to the country at the very end of this year?
I was aware of what was going on in the country, only the headline level. We didn't have a lot of time to read about all the bad things going on in Vietnam and even the assassinations in detail. We were too busy working. It was very satisfying, for us at the end of the year that way. Didn't realize until later that how things had improved that much.
I'd like to say in Jerry, we were really involved in doing stuff, trying to get to the moon, but if you go up to Bill Andrews, one of the crew members who has a museum kind of fair up in Washington State, as part of his museum displays, he has all the headlines, major headlines from the year. And when you see all those things listed together, it's really incredible that all that stuff happened, from even starting with the Tet Offensive in January and going on through the assassinations of King and Kennedy and the riots in Chicago and then all the stress and everything. You realize how much was going on in 1968, and I'm like Jerry there. I was caught up in trying to get to the moon, and so I didn't have time to really think about that very much. Didn't really appreciate it, I guess, until I saw it all assembled there in that museum.
And finally, Jim Lovell, I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about Mount Maryland and also some recent developments with Apollo 8 and the International Astronomical Union.
Well, for several things, of course, when we were planning for Apollo 8, we were able to see photography of the near side of the moon. And at the same time they were looking at Apollo 8, we were also looking ahead to see what were some of the lunar landing areas that we would first attempt a landing. And of course, the Sea of Tranquility was the most natural. And as we looked at the Sea of Tranquility, and our job was to look down there in orbit, because we'd be that close that we could take photography, and I found a small triangular mountain on the shores of Tranquility. And it pointed into the sea itself. And so, in doing my sketches to be informed, I said that I'm going to call that Mount Maryland. And it's sort of stuck on Apollo 8, and when we went around, actually, we saw it down there, and then other people picked it up too on Apollo 10, when they made the descent aboard landing. They actually photographed Mount Maryland as soon as the lunar module departed from the command module. Looking back, there was the initial point, Mount Maryland. And on Apollo 11, that was the stepping stone or the initial point for actually starting the descent back into the Sea of Tranquility for the actual landing. And so I guess I tried to get the International Astronomical Union to make that a sort of official name. That was not successful until just last year, I think that was the case, when they finally officially named that little triangular mountain, Mount Maryland.
Thank you, Robert. This question's for Walt Cunningham. Walt, Apollo 7 was the first manned mission after the Apollo 1 tragedy. It was the first mission to use the newly redesigned Apollo Command Module. Could you describe your feelings leading up to the launch?
Question for you. First off, I found it very interesting to listen to the Apollo crew and the people working on it. Do I have a couple of minutes so I can put that in perspective?
Absolutely.
Well, the Apollo program itself, when you stop and think about it, the objective was to land a man on the moon. And the first step in putting that in perspective is, I'll tell you this, the first mission was to test the Apollo command module. Then as it evolved, the next mission was to escape from the Earth's gravitational field. That's what Apollo 8 did, and go out to the moon. Then you still had to test the lunar module, and that was here in Earth orbit. And when it came to Apollo 10, it was to go through the entire lunar landing mission right down to about 50,000 feet above the surface, to all the procedures that had to be done. And then, as you know, Apollo 11, we went through all of that and landed a man on the moon. That was the big objective of the Apollo program as announced by President Kennedy 9 years before that. If we go back and look at the beginning of that, it sounds to me a little bit different as I hear how we take Apollo 8 and we go to the moon. How did we get there? Well, if you think back about it, we had Apollo 1. Apollo 1 was Gus Grissom, Ben White, and Roger Chaffee. At that time, Wallace Shaw, Don Ising, and I were scheduled in Apollo 2. And at that point, we had been able to start changing the design of the Apollo command module, and that was going to be for subsequent flights. And as that was going on, we were busy living with the contractors because it was the first time they had done a spacecraft, and there were a lot of things that they were not familiar with, having developed a lot of airplanes very successfully in the past. So as we were practically living with North America at the time, we also were generating a lot of changes. The schedule kept starting to slip. They ended up having a Block 1 spacecraft, which was 2 spacecraft, and then we did Block 2. Then they had the Block 2 spacecraft, and there were some differences between those spacecraft. For example, they were working on a space hatch that would open from the inside on Block 2, and that was already in the work before we had that fire. The public today doesn't know much about that. But all of our astronaut involvement was causing enough delays, if you will, and the engineers were enough delays that they ended up having to cancel Apollo 2. And there was Wallace Shaw, Don Ising, and I. At that point, they stopped, and Wally and Don and I became the backup crew on Apollo 1, as Gus had and Roger. And so it kind of changed the structure of the crews at the time. And after about 3 or 4 months, as we were the backup crew and working on the first launch of Apollo, you had the fire on the pad. That was a bad disaster with creating some, just detecting some problems that finally they knew had to be fixed. And so about 3 weeks later, the Wallace Shaw, Don Ising, and I were assigned to the first Apollo mission. And 21 months later, we 1,000 changes, and Apollo 1 was the first of 5 giant steps to the moon. And that's the thing to keep in mind. The first step was to successfully be in orbit. The second step was to escape the Earth's gravitational field and out in space, and that was what Apollo 8 did. Then you had Apollo 9, whose job was to test and perfect the lunar module. That was done in Earth orbit also. And then with Apollo 10, they went right down to 50,000 feet above the lunar surface and did everything they had to do up to that point. There's a number of reasons why it couldn't land on the moon, but people don't know about that today. But then came finally Apollo 11, and we landed on the moon. So each one of these missions, as opposed to being just unique by themselves, they played a critical step in what it took to beat the Russians. I am of the opinion that by the time we finished the Gemini program, we had, at that point, bypassed the Russians in their program, and I don't think it's known to this day really how seriously they took landing a man on the moon, because they never really got out to even away from the Earth's surface to do that. So by the time we finished up at that stage in the game, the Gemini program, I think we were ahead of the Russians at that time, and we've been ahead even today, even though we have not been flying our own spacecraft for a number of years now. So.
Thank you all. This question is for Arnie Aldrich. Bill Moon and Chuck Lewis got you to tell a story last night. The first spacecraft you brought back did not contain an astronaut, rather it contained the chimp Enos. You saw the couch that Enos was in our museum today. Maybe describe the condition of the couch today versus when Enos actually came back.
Is this live? Yes, I saw Enos's couch. It looks perfect. It looked like he hadn't flown yet. But, I was in charge of the re-entry monitoring at the Point Aguero tracking site for NASA on Mercury Atlas V, which was Enos's flight, and there were problems during the flight with the reaction control rockets, and there were other problems possibly in the environmental control system on board. We didn't know Enos had any problems, but it was supposed to go 3 flights, and starting with the second orbit, it had these problems, and we were tracking them at 8 stations going around the world. We didn't have satellite communications in those days, so we only had these tracking stations positioned around the world. And so we decided, it was really decided by Chris Kraft in the control center, that if they continued, we were going to end at the end of the second orbit. And so we came across the Hawaii site, and there were still problems with the reaction control system. And as we came up on Point Aguero, which is on the coast of California, it's part of Vandenberg Air Force Base, we had our tracking system looking at the firing of the rockets. There was still a problem. So I had my clock set up on the console to fire retro rockets at the exact time it would cause a spacecraft coming over California to land in the Atlantic Ocean. And we had the problems. I talked to Chris, said bring it down, and threw the switch, and Enos came down. After he came down, we found out that not only were the problems with the spacecraft, but he had been very unhappy. He had torn his catheter out. It was one part of his physiological condition and other problems. So it was a good thing to end. Yeah, that is the only human-focused spacecraft that's ever been brought down by ground command, and
I threw the switch, Chris said go, and we went. I wanted to say another couple of things about the Apollo 8, though. As Jerry Bostic said, when Chris Kraft called and asked if we thought we could do Apollo 8 and go to the moon right after Apollo 7, Dr. Jerry and me, and I was in charge at that time of all of the flight controllers for the Apollo spacecraft in the Mission Control Center and in back rooms. And we had been through the terrible tragedy of the Apollo fire, and then we'd been through the very successful flight that Walt just described, and we felt very confident about the Apollo spacecraft. And so I gave her to go ahead, but I also had another role. I was a member of the review board that George Lowe held on the Apollo program monthly with the North American contractor. And I went to each of their meetings, and I saw George Lowe interact with the contractor and with the other NASA people and define the problems that needed to be solved, define the solutions and approve them, and they were executed. So between my flight control team, who was monitoring these things and felt we were coming in the right direction, between what George Lowe was doing for the program, I felt like it was thumbs up to go to the moon with Apollo 8. And so my vote was there also.
Thanks, Arnie.
Thanks.
Charlie Duke, this is sort of a planned question. Earthrise represented the first images of Earth taken from moon orbit. What was it like to see the Earth from the surface of the moon?
Well, we didn't see it. We landed in the middle of the moon and the Earth was right overhead. And so you stand there in your spacecraft and you look up and you're looking at the top of your helmet. And the only time I saw the Earth from the moon was when we were just in the high-gain antenna. You had a little telescope and you could get this Earth centered in that and you could see it, but it didn't look right. But at the end of our stay, I did a high jump and I fell over backwards and I was laying flat on my back on the moon and hey, there's the Earth. And it was beautiful. A jewel of blue and white and brown. What a sight.
Thanks, Charlie. What was that, Walt?
Fall. That's right, yeah. It was, I learned a lesson on that. Never practice anything in space that you haven't, I would never do anything in space that you haven't practiced before. Don't do the high jump.
Arnie Aldrich, Chuck Lewis, and Bill Moon. Describe the mentality of the flight controllers. Gene Kranz mentions tough and competent. You hear failure is not an option. What does that mean to you? What was the mentality of flight controllers?
To us, we took an opportunity to monitor the spacecraft and it was our duty to ensure the crew safety, flight safety, and mission success at all costs. In our views, we did on the consoles. And I worked with Arnie. Whatever Arnie said to do, we did.
The first rule in it was crew safety. That's number one. And then secondly, the spacecraft and crew. That led to the philosophy, I think, of flight control and Chris Kraft, the young people. The attitude, well, I'll go back to what Walt said. You know, 8, 9, 10, 11 were all critical steps getting to the right of man on the moon. And I think 8 we're celebrating today, but I'd like to say that flight control, the ground network, that helped us with the telemetry data and so forth. The booster people, all Apollo 8 and the other flights nailed it.
These guys have said the right thing about the answer to the question. We trained and simulated and studied our systems and prepared our documentation, so we understood the spacecraft, we understood the procedures, and we were in sync with the crew with the simulations we did. But I wanted to say one other thing I wanted to say in the last little bit I had. You can't say enough about George Lowe, about what a wonderful leader he was. And I went to his control boards with the program and with the contractor for a number of years and watched how we recovered from the Apollo fire and those problems. And many years later, I was the program manager for the space shuttle. And when the Challenger accident occurred, I had the job of recovering and getting things back on track and getting things right. And I fell back on the lessons I learned from George Lowe when we went through a great review of the space shuttle, returned to flight, and flew 81 successful missions before we had a second accident.
Thank you. Dr. Schmidt, as the first scientist in the astronaut corps, you paved the way for a generation of scientists. Talk about the importance of science in space exploration today.
Could I say something?
You bet. Absolutely.
I want to remind everybody that the gentleman most of the gentlemen who have spoken with flight controllers were in their 20s when this all happened. You got to remember that. This was a young person program. And what they really were they mentioned, and correctly, crew safety was a primary goal, but what really was I looked at as a goal was how do you manage risk? Because risk doesn't disappear just because you say you're going to solve crew safety issues. The risk is always there, and we have to remember that. Space is not without its risks. And what we learned how to do in Apollo, at least, was to manage those risks. And that's why all of these missions were successful, because the risk was managed properly. And that would include even Apollo 13. We learned how to manage the risk of that mission once we understood what the risk was that we had not anticipated. So it's an important thing to remember for the future and going forward into the future, is that we're really managing risk. You're not going to eliminate it. It's going to be there. Now, with respect to the science side of things, that really started long before I ever flew. And thanks to Al Shepard and Jim Lovell, we were able to institute a training program that really magnified the returns on each of the missions that flew. Even though Jim and Fred didn't have a chance to land on the moon, they initiated a major new training program that Al Shepard flew. And that really started to get all the crews prepared to accomplish what we needed to accomplish relative to a true exploration program. The patriotic and the national security accomplishment of landing on the moon had already taken place. And then, thanks again to George Lowe and others, they realized early on that we would have a chance to do much more than that relative to the science of the moon and really the science of the Earth. And in anticipation of that, Lowe had already begun, even before the Apollo 11 landing, had directed Grumman to start to build a Block 2 lunar module that would then enable us to spend 3 days on the moon rather than just 1 day. Very important for exploration, and that needs to be thought of in the future as we extend our opportunities, because the return from a 3-day mission was far, far greater than you could have from a 1-day mission, and particularly it enabled us to have environmental control in the space suit that would allow basically an 8-hour EVA rather than a 4-hour extravehicular activity. So all of that, again, we go back to George I'll tell you, I'm with Arnie. He was one of the greatest men of the space program, no question about it. There were others, but George really did make a major difference. And I should add that having spent quite a bit of time, as Arnie did, in these configuration control board meetings, and also studying it later, George had already studied the lunar orbit mission when he was part of the space task group that Bob Gilbert ran, even before any decision had been made for the moon. And so he came into that decision in August with a lot of confidence that this could actually take place. And you saw it all the way through all the discussions that we were having at the time about the Apollo 8 mission, or what became the Apollo 8 mission, is that George was absolutely confident that this could be done. And obviously it could. My first experience with the Apollo 8 mission, the knowledge of it was when Frank Borman came to me and said, Jack, we're going to have a lunar orbit flight plan. And would you sort of put that together and coordinate between us and Bill Tyndall, who ran the flight operations planning meetings. And so I was flying back and forth to Cape, carrying different changes to that lunar orbit flight plan that we put together. It was, I'll have to tell you, I did not know about the breeding of Genesis. Even though I was responsible for coordinating the development of that flight plan. And at the same time, Jim and I were working on landmark tracking. Remember that, Jim? Because that was going to be an essential ingredient for accurate navigation of a landing on the moon. We sort of didn't get that right because of gravitational perturbations on Apollo 11, but with the pinpoint landing at a Severo on Apollo 12, we got that right, and that in turn was a contribution from Apollo 8 to the full exploration program that we had before we entered the Apollo program. So I would just have to say that my experience in Mission Control Center when AOS occurred, acquisition of signal, was that everybody in that center, all these 20-year-olds, were there because of the patriotism of their commitment to the program. And the fact that we didn't know everything else that was going on around us except through the headlines was just, I think, a clear testament to that patriotism that people were focused on, that this was the most important thing that we would be doing with our lives, at least as far as we can see. Thank you.
Today there's a lot of talk about long-duration spaceflight that centers around the moon and Mars. The ISS has had attendance since 2000. You were one of the first to experience long-duration spaceflight on Skylab. What does the future hold for long-duration spaceflight, and ultimately, what will it take to live on the moon and Mars?
Yeah, good question. I think we learned a lot on the Skylab space station that we didn't know about much. Much about what we were doing were medical experiments. We had some 60 experiments to do, and many of them were medical. Up until this time, we had spent only 2 weeks in zero gravity. And living in zero gravity is different than having gravity from the moon. It's kind of cheating, really. The way we look at it later is to have 1/6 gravity. And so the Skylab missions were an interim step between the short flights and the long flights that we're going to be flying later on the International Space Station and going back to the moon, Mars, and other things for long durations. So the Skylab space station was made out of leftover parts from the last 3 lunar missions that were not flown, and so we had some leftover parts and some leftover astronauts. And we had 3 flights of the Skylab on the durations of 1 month, and then 2 months, and then 3 months. And we learned a lot about the human body that we didn't know about. Every week we were given permission to either stay or to go for another week based on whatever our medical experiments were telling the doctors on the ground, and we were always able to go on to the next one. So we learned a lot medically about that. We also learned how to do zero gravity spacewalking. We weren't real good at that originally because we hadn't performed very well in Germany,
and any other spacewalks that we've done with zero gravity have been very short. And so we learned how to make a new space station, a bigger space station, how to live there in zero gravity in ways that we couldn't imagine before. And we also then developed extravehicular or spacewalking procedures that we were able to report back and say, we believe these are the things you can do on the International Space Station, these are things you can't do. So much of the International Space Station was put together based on the EVA procedures that we developed. Now, I'll get back to what you were talking about, how does this deal with the future. We came back from the International Skylab Space Station. In our cases, we had 20% less blood in our body fluids. We had lost 10% of our red blood cells, and we weren't making any new ones, which would mean that eventually you're going to die because they're replacing your body every day by your blood marrow, and if you don't replace them, you're going to run out of them in 140 days. So those were all unusual, unique experiences that we had no inclination about. But that was carried into the International Space Station. We're finding other things now that we've had to find remedies for. One now, of course, is vision. And vision is they're not exactly sure why we're having people who are staying up there for 6 or 7 months to start to have vision problems, but we're working on that, so that's one thing that has to be solved. But in each of these things that come along, bone loss as well, we're finding that we're losing about 1% of our bone mass per month in zero gravity, and we're going to have to find ways to remedy that. And but each one of these things that have come along so far, we've found ways that we can mitigate those problems. So we're going to have to live up there in the space station long enough so that we can understand what happens if you're away for 2 years, for example. So I believe there's a great hope for us in terms of solving those medical problems. There is the problem of radiation, of course. I don't think we know enough about how to mitigate the radiation effects. We're going to have to figure out ways to have something to eat and something to drink for, say, 2 to 3 years on our way to Mars. And so those are some of the hurdles, I think, that are before us. And not so the medical as well as habitability and a number of other cases that we have to solve. We don't want to get to Mars and find out that we have to rest for a month before we're able to get to work. So there's a lot, I think, that has to be done before we end up going to Mars, and I think we can help solve some of those problems in the upcoming plans that we have for going back to the moon and other programs like that. One thing other than I would like to add to some of this conversation is that the space program, the Apollo 8, the landing on the moon, all of the Apollo flights contribute a great deal more than we often consider politically. Because in those days, as has been pointed out, the Vietnam War was a very serious issue in the country. People were burning their draft cards, running off to Canada, and demonstrating and rioting and so forth. And President Nixon, in about 1967, I think it was, after I just gotten there, there were about 6 of us assigned to go visit with President Nixon, and he wanted us to go to the universities and colleges as individuals and find out what the problems really were, what is causing these people to do this and act the way they are, and how can we achieve a better situation. And so we did that and came back and made our reports, but nevertheless, irrespective of how much that contributed to the future, the facts are that the Apollo program, the landings on the moon, and all that we were doing was a real bright spot in that time in our political history. And I think that all the other things that it's contributed, well, that's one of those that is often overlooked, and that it was a real encouragement to the people of America to have these kind of achievements, despite the fact that things weren't so good in the country, and I think it had a lot to do with making them better. I don't know if this has answered all the questions that you had, but I'll be glad to try to do better if I
Great job. Thank you. Final question. This is for Flight Director Michael Staub, whose honorary teenager opportunity hasn't called home in quite some time. Michael, while we're celebrating an anniversary, you represent part of the future of space exploration. Discuss the importance of unmanned planetary exploration for the future of manned space exploration.
Well, I never thought I'd get to answer a question here. I'm starstruck here. I can't believe I'm sitting, a Kansas boy sitting here with these American heroes. It's overwhelming. To your first point, Jim, I want to thank again letting me come and share the InSight landing with the Cosmosphere. The joy, the excitement, the tension, the stress of those landings, and the fact that I get to work on these missions. And I get paid to do this. It's not a job. It's just going to work to play every day. I see the unmanned exploration is, I think, a vital part of any space exploration program that we're doing, because going to places like Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and New Horizons, going out to a Kuiper Belt object in a little over a month, those are places we can't send humans, but it gives us the ability to explore places that we cannot touch physically ourselves, but with our machines and with our ingenuity and with our creativity, we can reach these places. And one of the things I always love to remark when I do outreach talks is when I'm working on opportunity and we take pictures of Mars, I like to think that building those sequences, I'm taking pictures through the camera lenses of a machine that only 10 people in the entire world get to work on. And when we take those images, I feel like a part of myself is on Mars. And it's been a very troubling 5.5 months, because this spacecraft that, although it is a robot, those of us at JPL really do love what we do, and we feel a very strong connection with the missions that we're working on. And I always like to come back to a comment that our former lab director at JPL quoted right after the Curiosity landing in 2012. He was paraphrasing a quote by Teddy Roosevelt, and he said in his press conference that it is far better to dare mighty things, even though we might fail, than to live in the twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. And that comment, dare mighty things, has become a staple of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It is a statement that all of us who work there live by, because it says that as a group of engineers and scientists, as a nation, as a species, when we choose to dare mighty things and push ourselves, we're able to achieve greatness. And that was seen again on Monday with the successful landing of InSight. It is in our plans to go further out into the solar system to look for life on the moons of Jupiter, to look for life on the moons of Saturn, and to eventually move forward to taking astronauts back to the moon and onto Mars. And I really want to reiterate Administrator Bridenstine's comments that, at least for myself, those of us at JPL, we are very excited and we're very motivated when we have an administration that gives us a solid plan. And we are more than prepared. We've got a lot of young, bright minds at JPL who are very gung-ho, and we're ready to meet those challenges of the nation, whatever they may be. And we're excited to keep pushing the boundaries of American space exploration and American technology as we move further and further out into the solar system.
Thank you.
I think we're kind of come to the end at this point. I'd like to say one more thing, that I want to thank you for the opportunity to come here and be with the folks at the Cosmosphere. Clearly, I believe we have a similar mission, and you're doing such a great job in growing and projecting it and expanding it beyond your reach. And there's a short story I'd just like to, I've mentioned to a few people here, as to the origins of the Cosmosphere. Years ago, of course, there were a number of us who were active in the astronaut program, and some of us were hunters. I think Jack Schmidt was one of the hunters. Charlie Duke was one of the hunters, Walt Cunningham, and we had others who were not here. And we would go and participate in some of these social hunts around the country. The one-shot antelope hunt, or one-box pheasant hunt, or the Grand National Quail hunt. They would have teams that would come and hunt for a day and have a social gala in the evening, much like this, and also, but not quite as extravagant as this, which it has been. But nevertheless, that's what they were. And most of the people, we would go and we could be on the first team once at each one of these places, and after that we become a pass shooter. But we would have groups of maybe 4 people, a 4-man team of astronauts, 4-man team of governors, of senators, football players, and so forth. And so these were big social hunts, and there were a number of them. And we really enjoyed being part of them. And the people who put these hunts on were usually the same folks, fairly wealthy folks who could come to all these hunts and help sponsor them and just be there for the social work of it. And there was one fellow, however, who invited us to do something different. He said, how about just forgetting all this social stuff, and why don't you fellas just come and go hunting with me on my ranch? And his ranch was about 20 miles from here, I think. And we went and did that. And he said, well, while we're here, I'd like to take you over to Hutchinson, because there are some folks over there that are trying to start a museum. It's a space museum. We said, okay, that'll be great. So we drove over here, and it was, as I recall, must have been in the 70s, early 70s, or maybe sometime around there. And so we saw this place, and there was a little hole in the wall, kind of a storefront, I guess. They had a few things inside, not much of anything. And so we said to ourselves, like some of you have probably said, well, that's a nice idea, but who's going to come to a space museum in Hutchinson, Kansas? Little did they know. But the point is, this is the way it all started in our view, and it's come to this point, and it's just unbelievable what you've been able to do and what you're doing, the support you have, and the people who come from a wide variety of disciplines, and lots of places all over the country. We've met people tonight who've come from lots of places far away just to be here. So my hats are off to you, and I think I can vouch for all of my colleagues here that we want to thank you for this opportunity. We look forward to working with you in the future, and wish you God bless and happy landings. Thank you.
Sharing the Q&A with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our honored guests, thank you on behalf of the Cosmosphere, Hutchinson, the state of Kansas, and this nation. We are indebted, and we thank you for what you have done.
So before we do, one last thing to take care of. Again, I want to thank our honored guests. It was a privilege to celebrate this historic achievement with you all. As we depart here tonight, we want to leave all of you with this message from the crew of Apollo 8.
Because those of you that were measure of the water quality safe. God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on this good earth.
Thanks for listening to the Cosmosphere podcast. Make sure you share and subscribe to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review on iTunes. Reviews are crucial to the success of podcasts, so we'd appreciate it if you could take just a minute to leave a rating or review in iTunes. It helps more people find out about the show, and you can help us spread the word. We'll be back in 2019 with new episodes, more history, more science, and more interviews. Thanks for joining us in 2018, and we look forward to having you back next year. For the Cosmosphere, I'm John Molnix.